of ways that we, understand and learn about food history. And we welcome you to join us. Dues are just $25 per calendar year. I'll put the link in the chat to that if anyone's interested, if you're not already a member. And membership includes this robust schedule of programming and a range of price points, both virtual like today and in person in areas throughout the Delaware Valley. So I'm going to put that link in as well, just so you can see all the great programs we have coming up. Planned by Dan, who's our fabulous program manager, director. And I just want to talk about the next program coming up. And I'm so excited about this. I purchased his book, David Shields, this Arc of Taste. I know it's backwards on the camera, but it's just, I can't rave about this book enough. So our next program, it's Thursday, March 21st at 6:30 p.m. Entitled The Arc of Taste, Reviving the Lost Foods of the U.S. And our presenter will be Dr. David Shields. He's a professor at the University of South Carolina, and he's the chair of the Arc of Taste Southern Region for Slow Food USA, as well as the Carolina Gold Rice Foundation. His critical research has helped revive over 30 heirloom crops. He goes over a lot of these heirloom crops in the book. They include Carolina Gold Rice, the Bradford Watermelon, and the Hicks Mulberry. His latest book, as I mentioned, The Arc of Taste, and other books include Southern Provisions, Taste the State, and The Culinarians, which also is dear to my heart because he mentions James Parkinson in $1,000 Dinner, which I've written about. So he and I have a lot of connections, and it's just really great. He also has a Substack newsletter I recommend called Food Lore and More, and he puts out many intriguing articles on a regular basis. And he has a wonderful website dedicated to heirloom Southern fruits called Old Southern Orchards. And I'm going to put the link to register in the chat here if anyone is interested. And then Dan is going to introduce Sally. And just, some housekeeping, please do keep yourself muted. And then at the end, Sally can answer any questions. Feel free to put them in the chat as she's speaking, and I will do the Q&A with her afterwards. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Becky. I'm Dan Macy. I'm the program chairman of the Historic Foodway Society of the Delaware Valley. I welcome everybody. I first became acquainted with Sally Grainger through her seminal cookbook, which was the first cookbook to explore the cuisines of the Mediterranean in ancient times. It was published in 1996 and is called The Classical Cookbook, which she wrote with Andrew Dalby. She has also translated into English Apicius, a Roman cookery book compiled in the 5th century AD, as well as wrote Cooking Apicius, which she put together 64 modern interpretations of recipes in the original text. She produced the book in 2006 with her partner, Chris Grockock. All of her works became sources for my entries I wrote for the Oxford Companion to Cheese on Cato, a Roman senator who wrote a guide to gentlemen Roman farmers that included what is believed to be the first recipes for cheesecakes. Sally is considered one of the world's foremost experts on Roman cooking and prides herself on being a hands-on food historian, the exact qualities that the original founders of our Historic Foodway organization shared as well, just for historical cooks centuries later. Over the years, Sally has worked with English heritage, national, international museums, and many universities, helping to interpret and present Roman foodways. Her main interest has been to better understand and recreate the Roman condiment garum, the ancient fish sauce. She even wrote a book about it in 2021. She started her career as a chef, but after an ancient history degree, she luckily turned to experimental archaeology and food history. I am very honored to introduce Sally Grainger. Just have to unmute, Sally. There we go.
I think I have.
Great.
I have
Thank
unmuted
you.
myself.
Yes,
Thank you very
awesome.
much for that. Share screen. Right. Oh, excellent. It's up.
It's running. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That's a lovely introduction. Thank you very much indeed. It's a pleasure to be here. Pompeii is a magical place for food studies because it is in such a spectacular way, precisely because of the nature of the eruption. The pyroclastic flow that destroyed the city preserved a unique snapshot of ordinary Roman life. People were in the act of eating their supper when the volcano erupted, and food debris was left everywhere. It's one of the most unique sites across the empire, as I'm sure you know. The imagery is what strikes you first. Glorious frescoes of banqueting scenes, but also simple shop signs, graffiti, even crude cartoons inside cheaper bars reveal immense detail about the potential food choices of all the levels of Pompeian society. The architecture of what was a thriving commercial city selling goods and services to the masses is also immensely revealing. The structure of eating houses and their kitchens is especially interesting for me, as I like to cook using experimental archaeology and as authentically as possible. Ceramic forms and the process of classification was principally used to date a site in Roman archaeology, in all kinds of archaeology. What the Romans actually did with their pots was of little interest to archaeology. But things have moved on a good deal. The science behind pottery analysis has become a powerful tool. Pottery function is being considered at last. Residue analysis of these ceramics and now their metal vessels too can reveal details about the precise content of meals and in fact previous meals in the same pot. We can also see aspects of bulk food production and staples such as oil, wine and fish sauce. There is a marvel of organic matter preservation. Cakes, bread and fish sauce. That one is of particular interest to me. And to cap it all, we can now have analysis of Roman poo. The sewers at Herculaneum, the smaller seaside resort nearby, reveal the daily diet of the town's working middle and lower classes, and they are not necessarily poor. The diet is quite varied. And of course, the renewed interest in the food of Roman Pompeii has been sparked by two recent finds. There is the pizza fresco, which sadly is not pizza, and the cockerel bar, more of which are not. So we have a huge amount of material to cover. And I obviously can't do any more than skim the surface of much of it, but I will be dwelling on the things that interest me the most. So I am unable to move my screen. Would somebody like to to move my screen for me to the next slide? My normal way of doing it is not available to me.
Let me try, Sally. I don't think I have access either. Dan, are you able to?
When we logged on before, I could do it. I flipped from one to the other.
Yeah, I don't have access to do that. Do you want to try to reshare your screen, Sally?
Let's stop sharing and reshare.
Yeah. Let's try that. That's what Tegan was saying too.
Let me try it this way. This is the one that okay.
Yeah, and if you go to presenter view usually, or yeah, if you go from there.
I'm not.
Is it letting you click on? There you go. Yay.
We're back. Sorry about that.
No, great.
Right.
Thank you.
I will be concentrating on these images. The images through wall paintings. Now that's here we are. Third slide. I'm going to concentrate on kitchen design in a commercial and domestic setting. I'm going to look at the dining at home and in eating bars and how that works. We're going to look at fish sauce as much as we can, uses, and of course the umami nuke that we get from fish sauce. We're going to then look at organic food residues, vegetable matter, seeds and spices, seasonings, and the Apicius recipes, who Apicius was, and how those seeds and spices in Apicius correspond to the recipes that we find. And then we'll look at frescoes generally and specifically the pizza. So kitchen design, this is fascinating to me, it's fascinating to everybody. These structures were simply a raised platform with a raised sort of ridge around the outside, and you put your pots and your pans under either charcoal or wooden fires. There is always a storage area underneath for the wood. In early illustrations, people assumed they were the oven, but I'm sure it would have sort of burnt people's ankles if they'd stood in front of the platform and had a fire underneath. They tend to be small and pokey. They tend to have what is described as a toilet next to the cooking platform very often, but it's just the area where all the rubbish from the household was thrown, including the gazundas, as I would call it. And so everything, all the rubbish is thrown down there. The image on the bottom right, which you can hardly see really because of the images of the people, but you can see that the platform is slightly different. Instead of just a flat surface with the ridge around the outside, there are ridges that stand proud, and you can push your charcoal into those spaces and force the heat to be more intense. Because of course, if you pile charcoal on top of each other, it burns hot. Then you just stand your pots on top of those ridges. I've always wanted to duplicate that and to see how effective it was. It's the only one I found in Pompeii. Now, there's a secret game you can play is to spot my red handbag, which are on all of my cooking platforms. Everywhere I've been, I leave my red handbag there so that you can see scale. So lots of other images of these cookers. The top left is fascinating. All those pots and pans were actually in situ when it was excavated. And you can see bottom left, there is a structure that almost certainly is an oven, and it vented out into the street, which is hugely sophisticated. And so some kitchens are quite primitive and simple, others, like the one bottom left, others really, really complicated and exciting to work in, I'm sure, and to view. So archaeologist has said that 40% of the poor urban dwellings and 66% of the middle class homes had fixed hearths for cooking. So the rest of the people living in Pompeii had no means of cooking at all. And this is the reasoning behind the idea that Pompeii people, and in fact Roman people all over the empire, ate an awful lot of street food because they had no cooking area that was safe. In Pompeii, and in fact all Roman cities, there are ground level commercial units and domestic dwellings, but higher floors, it's like a garret. I think that you've got families living in individual rooms, and it's mostly made of wood, and so the idea of cooking is going to be dangerous. And so you have to either cook at ground level in somewhere in a shared space, or you have to eat street food. But I don't think shared facilities are not considered enough. And this is why these are some of the examples of portable hearths that you find. They're very effective. I have a replica of the one made of sheet steel. That's my husband's legs and my legs, and we're in the UER. It's a museum outside Rome which has replicas of every conceivable kind of Roman artifact has been replicated in the museum. So this is quite a heavy piece of kit, but it's brilliant for barbecuing. You can boil at the back. You push your wood fire, I think it's wood rather than charcoal, to the back, and you have your bronze pots in those circles. And you can also push that shelf unit back or the other way to expose the fire underneath. I don't think it's proper barbecue days. I think it's a instant shelf unit that gets pushed away and it sort of moves on either side. So extremely effective, and I think there would be many more of these available to share amongst residents of an insula, the insula being a block of domestic dwelling. So the most impressive kitchen in Pompeii is from the Villa of the Mysteries. It's an immensely exciting villa. It's outside the city. city walls, and the frescoes are famous. They're absolutely exquisite. But for me, it's the kitchen is what makes it. It is just outstanding. It's a huge room. There were it was covered all the way around, so that the cooking areas were all completely protected from rain, but the central area was exposed to let the smoke out. So this cooking platform is enormous. I could barely reach across to halfway. If I was standing to the left of that picture, I couldn't reach any more than halfway across. And I imagine these platforms were actually used to store all the equipment. So it was all pushed to the back and to the side. You just had a little area of a charcoal fire. I think it's likely to be charcoal always for these raised platforms. The oven, which sort of exits forward, which I think is rather strange, as you'll see with the next slide, but it's quite an impressive oven. It's dome shaped and well used. There's another 2 ovens in the same kitchen, and very little else survives, but there must have been wooden tables everywhere for preparation purposes. So this is in Herculaneum. This was a kitchen that was in an area of Herculaneum that was not open to the public, and I had to go and bribe one of the guides because I knew it existed. I'd seen a picture, and so I climbed over a number of walls and fell and got completely covered in dust. But I finally found it, and it's a wonderful structure. It's an L-shaped platform with an oven, just like we saw before, that vented out into the street. And the interesting thing is, you can pull the embers out of your oven after it's heated. You put your bread or your meat in, you shut the door, your embers are out on the platform, and you can continue cooking with those embers. And they don't last long. They don't have a huge intense heat, but they're excellent for delicate cooking. I've cooked a custard and set a custard that looked like a cream caramel on these embers. A lovely illustration from my book on the left. And so this is my cooking platform at home. This is my Roman kitchen. We started out with a platform that was freestanding down at the bottom in the middle there, and then we got an oven, and it was initially its opening was forward, but now we've turned it round so it faces onto the platform exactly the way that you saw with that cooking platform. So I can use my embers to cook delicate food. And this is a shot from the YouTube videos that I make of various Roman dishes. So other kinds of cooking, sub-test tube baking. This is a form of baking under a upturned pot. It really is. It's hugely effective. You heat your pot over a charcoal fire until it's as hot as it can get. You then take the pot away, clear the hearth. You put your bread or your cake directly down on the hearth. In the center here is a libum from Cato, as we were talking. You put the pot back over the cake and you put the embers across the top of the flange. Incredible baking, as I'm sure you all know. It's very similar to what's happening now with sourdough baking. It's a very moist environment. You get a fabulous crust. You get lit. A lovely illustration from my book of the way it works. Line drawing. To the left at the top there is a klibanos, which is a 2-piece version of the same technique, really. The dome is less pronounced, but the flange is there to take the coals, and there's a flange on the bottom section. So it acts as a casserole, possibly for meat, possibly also for cakes. I had a replica made, but it didn't last long. It fell apart. While the testum that's in the middle at the bottom there, the pale sort of creamy one, is still intact. It's still what I use for baking. While the one top right was the first one I ever had, and again that fell apart very quickly. So the technique for making it so it stays intact is quite difficult for potters to grasp. I struggle always to find new testum when my old ones break, but hugely successful way of baking. So the popina, the cowpona, the taverna, they all have different names, but there's no way to distinguish all these names and to define them. It's about 150 in Pompeii. And they all have the same structure, very formulaic structure. You have the buried dahlia. You have a platform which is solid structure, and along this counter you have buried dahlia. No food residues that could actually confirm what they were used for. There is food residue in them, but it tends to be rubbish. It tends to be thrown away. No drainage holes. None of these dahlia in all these Popina bars, bar one, has drainage holes, so they could be washed out. So what were they used for? It's very, very difficult for anybody to work out how they were used. I think it's all about the heat. Any food that's being sold in these bars or shops, I think they are multifunctional in the sense that they sell food, they sell wine, they sell takeaway food, and they sell food at the back that you can sit and recline or sit on benches to eat. So it is right, all kinds of commercial purchasing. And the food that's on display is going to get damaged by the heat, and the inside of these dahlia in this structure is going to be cool. So everything goes in there. That's what I believe. And so you can't say that you can't identify what is being sold in these bars, because you can't. It's all the same structure. But of course they did cook too. These kind of braziers are quite common, attached to the counter. You can see, almost certainly used for wood. You would have put a cauldron on that, I think, quite easily, and produced some kind of stew or soup. So Athenaeus talks about the fact that there's nothing but broth with chunks of meat in it, but then that's rather good that there's chunks of meat in it, because the assumption is that this kind of food was vegetarian. Now, graffiti mentioned things like bread and special kinds of bread, puero pane, which is either translated as children's bread or slaves' bread, wine, cheese, porridge, pulques. But we do know they sold meat. They must have sold meat here, and it must have been roasted meat, barbecued meat. The story that the Emperor Claudius, who was in court presiding over court cases, and he could smell some meat cooking from a Popina, and he got up and he left the court and went to get a snack. And we also know a little later than Claudius that emperors sought to ban meat from sale in these Popina. And of course, you don't ban something unless it really happens. And as the historian Dio Cassius says, it's clear that the populace used to gather and drink and talk and complain about the emperor in these places. Hence, you ban people from you ban something really good from being sold, then less likely to want to gather together. That's the theory anyway. Again, there's a little fresco on the right, which is a little hard to see because of the way the screen is set up. But these guys are sitting at table. They're probably gambling and drinking. They're sitting rather than reclining. And above their heads on this fresco, you can see hanging sausages and other kinds of meat. So you're being told this is what you can buy in our bars. So here's an example of how they are actually put together. These dahlia are enormous, completely buried. Very often you find the shelf unit is part of this structure. So at one end of the counter, you've got these shelf units so that you can display exactly what is being served, and hence, there's a red handbag for sale. So Juvenal famously describes a Popina in Ostia where assassins, sailors, thieves, fugitives, slaves, executioners, coffin makers, and priests of Cybele could be found. But that's Juvenal. Ordinary people went to dine and recline and eat food off the street. There's a lot of gambling going on, I'm fairly sure, as well. Now, Marshall talks about a Popina that has burst its threshold, and I love this idea because it clearly implies tables on the street and an awning and stopping the traffic on the pavement. Lovely idea. This is a bar fairly small bar, and these two pictures, these two structures actually face each other with a very small gap between the two, as you can see, because one of the plinths that people sit on, these are clearly benches for sitting on and eating, sitting up. While this is a reclining couch covered in cushions where you would have lain down to eat your food. So there's two ways to consume food in this bar. But they face each other, and either there was a screen made of wood, maybe, between the two, but it seems hard upon each other, really, to have the two styles of dining so close together. An interesting idea. So my favorite quote here: reclining or sitting up is the key when you're eating in a Roman style. So this is Marshall, and he's talking to Maximus, and he says, Sariscus recently had a full 10 million sesterces given to him by his former master. Actually, it says poured into him, thinking, I can't see it, but it's there. Wandering around 4 bathhouses, he got through it on bistro stools. So in the process of going from bathhouse to bathhouse, he spent 10 million sesterces, and he did it sitting up. What a gullet! What a lot! How large a gullet to eat 10 million, but how much larger to do it sitting up? How much more food he must have consumed while sitting up, because obviously food sitting up is cheaper than food when you recline. Also interesting, I think. Oh, and also potentially Sariscus is a slave. Certainly his attitude to food is quite low status, and his former master means his patron has given him as a bequest this money. Was that because he was a slave, or because he was just a lower status person? We don't know. So what we have here also is an implication that bathhouses were also eating houses, and we know that bathhouses were sports and leisure, are places where people play in sports. So we have a sports and leisure centre every time we have a bathhouse, where you can eat quite a substantial amount of food, clearly. So this is not Pompeii, this is Ostia. This is one of these, it's a bar, it's a restaurant for sitting and eating. It's at the back of the structure. It's quite a large, elaborate bar. There are dining areas with couches, 2 or 3 of them, quite elaborate. A large area for benches for eating, and the shelf unit, as we see. And this wonderful fresco, which is just breathtaking from the point of view of food history. Never to have seen something quite so illustrative of what is available in the bar. The prandium is a lunch. I think it's a lunch menu. So the image on the right is either a musical instrument, it's maracas, maybe they're getting entertainment, but I think it's possible that it's bread, because bread is in Pompeii sometimes, we know, tied with string. There's certain survivals of bread that actually have the string in place. So we know that they were strung up. So maybe it's a piece of bread. In the middle is a traditional wine cup with the little bubbles on the glass, which we know were there to stop you slipping out, stop it slipping out of your hand if you had greasy fingers. Of course, you're eating with your fingers, so you would have greasy fingers. And on the left is a plate of food. So let's look at it with a more interesting contrast. Likely to be a radish. We know that radishes were part of this process of dipping, and we have a sauce to dip into. Olives or pulses or beans. And you have meat on a skewer. You can see the meat chunks to one side of those meat skewers. And then there's the cup sitting in the middle of the olives. And because we know that wine has been illustrated already, that is the cup that the dressing is served in. The Romans would consume, at the beginning of their meal, various either bread or vegetables or meat, and they dip it into what was called an oinogarum. is a mixture of wine, oil, and fish sauce. Also honey, also sweet wine, also vinegar. But basically, it's a vinaigrette. And you would have to beat it to keep it stable so that you could dip your vegetables into it, or bread or meat. Sometimes the oiny garum was thickened to stabilize them to stop the oil separating out to the top. But I usually use a vinaigrette recipe, i.e. a vinaigrette ratio, when I make these sauces, because that is what they are. They are vinaigrette. So let's look at the cockerel bar. This is our first of the new evidence from last year. We've seen what these bars are like. It's very similar. There's nothing new about this apart from the glory of the painting, because it was completely buried and not exposed to the elements. These paintings have been preserved. I don't know how they're going to keep them preserved, because it's the rain that destroys them so often. So we have a cockerel, and we have an illustration of duck, and the dog on a lead. I don't think that means that they're selling dog meat. I think that means if you try and steal anything from this bar, you will let him off the lead, I suspect. It's quite a complex structure. It goes in and out in a interesting way. We have images from myth, and we have obviously amphora and glass vessels, which are interesting on the top of that shelf. I'm not sure what they are for, but clearly they're selling wine. And the Dolia have been examined in great detail. So it's part of the unexcavated northeastern section of Pompeii. Inside one of these Dolia, they found duck bones, which is interesting given the illustration. Clearly, they probably wanted to serve some kind of a duck stew, but also goat and pig, fish, and snails. I don't think there's a Roman meal using all those things. It's rubbish. It's been thrown in at the end of the life of the bar. At the bottom of one of the containers are fava beans, and somebody suggested that fava beans were used to filter wine, clear it. Some paraphernalia, bronze ladle, some amphora, and an oil vessel, and some human remains were found. But it's likely, I think they did know that this particular bar had been excavated in the 19th century, and therefore by not archaeologists but people looking for treasure, and the human remains were found in the bar and they were placed in the vessel. That's the assumption. So it's a fabulous bar, but it doesn't tell us any more, and we're still struggling to understand what those dolia are really used for. So, private booth dining at a guild house. This is Boscoriali, which is a town outside of Pompeii, and the structures now have gone. I think the archaeology is destroyed, but it's a guild house. So every crafts industry in Roman life, for instance, you've got builders, you've got glassmakers, mosaicists, fresco painters. They all gather together in a guild to share their skills, to share their knowledge, to congregate, to have a guild house. And this is a guild house, but we don't know what exactly. It doesn't say, but you can see dining rooms on one side and they are mirrored on the other, with a garden in the middle. And these are public private dining rooms that you could hire. We think there is evidence of wooden shutters that came forward to shut you off from your neighbours. But it's also, I think, possible to sit down to recline at dinner and to have to share the couch with a stranger or a colleague, a business colleague. So you wouldn't necessarily hire the entire sort of triclinium. What's interesting, I think, is that there are shelves in front of the couch. So the couch comes to a gentle rise and then drops down and produces a little shelf before it runs down to the ground. And that's where you'll put your personal cup and plate. And of course, the wonderful kitchen at the end, the perfect platform for cooking. So reclining means that you are restricted in your movements. You're eating one-handed because one arm is taken up holding you up. Can you reach the food? There's an etiquette attached to this. You're not supposed to get up. And there's a certain amount of uh, uh, bad behavior, and misbehaving is not allowed. You're supposed to behave yourself on these couches. Now, Plutarch suggests that you either tip the slave at the door or you are simply not rude to him in order to get the food brought to you that you want. Food and dishes are brought to various people in the triclinia, and you're not supposed to get up and reach for it. One of my favorite quotes. This is a poem about banqueting behavior. You can see, of course, on the left, the shelf in front of the couch is more pronounced even than ever on that one, so you can put your plate or dish in front of you. So, banqueting behavior. Remember how you ought to conduct yourself at a banquet. When something is passed around to you, stretching out your hand, partake of it politely. It passes on, do not hold it back. It has not arrived yet. Do not project the desire forward, but wait around until it comes to you. Clearly, people were hogging the dish of food, not passing it on, or being very impatient to get it to come forward. So this is an idea of what you should be doing. This is, I'm pretty certain this is in a domestic, private sort of situation. So not Pompeii, not even Italy, but Asia Minor and 5th century. So 400 years later and out of the country entirely, but a glorious scene of a Roman feast, which is so humorous. I always show it because it just makes me laugh. There are 3 chickens that are being torn apart on those tables. The debris and rubbish from the banquet has been hurled to the floor, and in fact, there is a classic mosaic of banquet rubbish that has just been discarded, the shells, the seafood, and the bits of vegetables and so on. There is a wine heater on the bottom right. People are walking around, and some of them look very much worse for wear. So, still a Roman banquet, still exactly the same style of consumption, and immensely amusing. So, Roman food has had, still has for some people, a terrible reputation. It's assumed that the Romans were just gluttons, and they consumed vast quantities of food and throw up in the corner and went on and continued to eat more food. It's very annoying that reputation still holds for some people. But the gluttony is largely visual and not actual. You're supposed to marvel at the food, but you don't get very much of it when it actually comes to your little dish in front of you at the table. The whole idea of a vomitoria is false, of course. It's nothing to do with a system of being ill. Why would it? Vomitoria is the name applied to the passageways between the seats in the amphitheatre so you can exit quickly after the show. Very often, the accusation of gluttony is political. It's got very little to do with what people do. It's all about challenging your rivals. Clearly, people were greedy, and clearly, people were, behaved disgracefully. But it doesn't define a nation the same way that somehow the gluttony defined the Romans for a long time. Yes, there are strange, odd foods. Lark's tongue, very strange. Dormice, sow's udder, very difficult to understand. But clearly they were slaughtering and eating sows that had many litters, and so the udder was going to be consumed. It's very hard to find. I don't think I want to try it, to be honest, but I'm curious. I must have. Brains and sweetbreads, why not? Offal, not eating offal is terrible waste. Now, I heard a statistic fairly recently that something like 90% of offal goes into dog food in the UK. I suspect it's 100% in the States. I know in the US, I think offal is not as popular in America as it is here, and I love it. I would eat any offal offered to me. I passed over dormice. I have eaten a dormouse. I had to. As a food historian, I had to experience it. I went to Split, Croatia, and there's an island off the city of in the bay called Brač, and they have a tradition of eating dormice at certain times of the year as a festival. Many of the people we met when we went to try it said that as children, dormice meat was the only meat they were ever given because there was nothing else on the island. So I said I wanted to try it. And one was caught within half an hour and slaughtered and spit roasted, and they gave me a try, and I won't do it again. It wasn't very nice, very gamey, very chewy, and but it was an experience. Now, Roman dormice were fattened for the table, and they were almost certainly boned and skinned and stuffed, and probably quite nice, and sweet meat, fed honey and honey soaked bread morsels, and made to be nice. But these were wild dormice, and of course it was in the spring as well, so they hadn't been fattened. They hadn't fattened themselves. So the other, of course, strange ingredient that everybody goes, "Ooh, Roman food," is the stinky garum, and this has been the source of my research for the last 10 years. I did an MA in archaeology, and my dissertation was to understand fish sauce. So not stinky and not rotten, glorious. So we'll talk about fish sauce again in a minute. So dining etiquette, it's a bit like sharing tapas or meze. Whole animals could be served and look spectacular and be carried around the room, but then they would be carved by the slaves into small portions to be given to you in your little dish. And the remainder went back into the kitchen to be used again. And in fact, in Apicius, there is huge amounts of recipes with leftover meat. And they're quite not heavily spiced, but spices are used all the time. But the spices obviously help to maintain the meat's freshness over the next couple of days. The spices, obviously, the spices retard bacterial growth. They don't mask meat that's already gone up. But the little cups to the left, Samian-ware cups, these are the cups that the oinigarum dressings were originally served in. So these are different cups for the ones we saw in the ostia bar. And Samian-ware of different sizes for communal plates of food, I think, on the right. So fish sauce was fundamental to ancient Mediterranean cuisine. It was a complex evolution of numerous different types of sauce made from all kinds of different fish and parts of fish with salt. But basically, it's still just fish and salt. The earliest evidence is from Athens in the 5th century. And very much fish sauce was a Greek sauce. Pompeii, of course, was a Greek colony. Fish sauce was popular in Magna Graecia in the south of Italy. It eventually traveled to Rome and became popular in Rome too, but the source is Greek. There's an awful lot of disgust, confusion, and awe from the Romans themselves about fish sauce. They thought of it as wrong. Of course, it seems to be wrong, but it is fermentation with enzymes and friendly bacteria and perfectly safe, even though it probably smells at different times more rank than others. So there is a basic kind of fish sauce which resembles the nuck nam and nam pla of Thai and Vietnamese food. The differences are quite important. And here's a copy of my book, The Story of Garum, which came out in 21, just for your interest. So there are two types of fish sauce. Second one, liquamen, is the one that resembles nuck nam or nam pla. It's basically a whole small fish, anchovy, sardine, mackerel, mixture of all three, They are mixed with salt at a ratio of about 15% salt by weight. And bearing in mind that Thai and Vietnamese fish sauce use about 25 to 30%, a huge difference in salt. If you use too much salt, the enzymes are slowed down and impeded completely. This is why Thai and Vietnamese fish sauce take anything up to 18 months to be created. Roman fish sauce uses 15%. It can turn out a sauce. You can actually create a sauce in about 3 months of a decent quality as well, high protein. Liquamen was a pale amber in color, described as looking like 80/20 wine by Pliny. And because of the low salt, it's got a delicate salt flavor. Its umami is very strong. It's great. Umami punch, but you don't just get the salt. Now, in Thai in Vietnamese sauce, really, it's just upfront salt and nothing else. So this is liquamen. This is the basic fish sauce of the cook and the recipe in a picky, basic dressing. Garum is something different. Garum was invented, I believe, by Marcus Gavius Piccius himself. He decided to experiment with the blood and viscera from mullet originally. So it was called garum sociorum, garum of the allies, of the companions, i.e. more mullet. So you take the blood and the viscera from these fish. Bleeding fish, to harvest the blood before it coagulates, is hugely complex. It's a mad thing to do, but they did it. And they started to do it with mackerel instead of mullet because they were larger and there was more blood. There's an awful lot of blood in a mackerel. And eventually tuna was used to make what was called garum, garos hymation, bloody garum. It's still fermented with salt and it's aged. It looks black and bloody, and it was predominantly a table sauce. So it didn't get used in the kitchen. The cook didn't put it into food. It went onto food. So sort of a black sheen dribbled over your food when it's served. This is the kind of fish sauce that people were in awe and fear of. And this is the kind of sauce that scholars in the last 100 years or so viewed as being the only fish sauce. Somehow it was assumed that liquamen and garum were combined together in one. So you have small fish fermenting, and then you add extra blood. But getting that extra blood is almost impossible unless you really are determined. How on earth do you bleed mackerel in such quantity to gather enough blood to make a garum? It's mad, but they did. They did it, but it was not the bulk fish sauce that was traded widely. It was an elite and quite a small market. So most liquamen was made in Spain, Portugal, North Africa, and it was shipped as a fish mash, i.e. you start the process of dissolving the fish, you add the salt, you leave it to sit for a couple of months, or possibly even less, to be honest, until it looks like that strange mixture on the bottom right. That's my fish sauce being made in fish tank. You then transfer that into our amphora, you add a bit of brine, and you send it off on its journey across the Mediterranean, and it ferments en route. Pour off the liquamen at the port, and the remaining fish mash is rebrined. And it can, in fact, be rebrined 3 times. We know this from rabbinical sources in Palestine. They talk about the process of rebrining the fish sauce 3 times. They say, in fact, that the third rebrining took place not with brine, but with wine, and the wine had to be kosher. And so the rabbis are interested in this. Of course, they go to the port and they make sure that this is the first and the second rebrining. And they say, this has been exhausted, and so it needs wine to pep it up, and the wine has to be kosher. And this is written in rabbinical debate. So a fish mash can generate 3 times more fish sauce than we ever thought. And I also think that it's sold unfiltered. So the image in the middle of the ladle, pouring it out, this is the kind of texture, consistency of fish sauce when it's bought. and it's the cook, I think, that filters it, takes the fish paste out of it. Top middle, this is fish sauce factory Troya in Setúbal in Portugal, and these tanks are enormous. And there's rows and rows and rows of them. They are making hundreds of thousands of gallons of fish sauce mash, which is then going on to generate 3 times more fish sauce than we imagine from the volume of the tank. It's a phenomenal trade. Huge quantities of liquamen is being transported all over the Roman Empire, so that wherever the Romans go, they want oil, they want wine, and they want fish sauce. 3 liquid commodities that are transported in Alpha and make up oina garum, which I think is wonderful. Ironic. You go to Hadrian's Wall, you go to Palestine, you go to North Africa, Egypt, Asia Minor, everywhere you find Romans. India, you find amphora for fish sauce. Everywhere you find the Romans, you find liquamen. It must have been a special product, magical product, to transform food in order to get so far and so wide. So fish sauce in Pompeii is really exciting because there is evidence of the elite trade in garum and liquamen using these special bottles. They're called urkii, and they come tiny, under about a 200 milliliter size, right up to about 4 liters, and they have inscriptions telling us who made it, whose factory it was, what kind of fish it was. This picture of the urkii was taken at the Naples Archaeological Museum attic store. So I was given permission to go up and look, and there was about 6 rooms along a galley with the roof in the roof space. The dust was phenomenal. You couldn't breathe because every time you lifted anything up, the dust would fly everywhere, and I couldn't read any of the inscriptions because there was so much dust. One interesting phenomena, just in passing, and it confused me. In a number of books about food in Pompeii, they suggest, early books, that there weren't any Roman mortaria. There were marble mortaria, but very few ordinary ceramic mortaria. And I came to this store and looked behind the urkii, and that was stack upon stack of Roman mortaria. So it just goes to show it's always you read these things and you think, oh, there's no mortaria in Pompeii. Absolutely there are. So most important importer and manufacturer of fish sauce was a guy called Aulus Umbricius Scaurus. He was famous for the inscriptions on the urkii, and his villa doesn't exist anymore, but he had a special mosaic made illustrating the kind of fish sauce that he served in these wonderful urkii. So again, I went to the storeroom at the Pompeii site store. I was given permission to go in and look at the urkii that they held. So this is close-up versions of this mosaic where he's telling you that he's selling liquamen, liquum, liquamen, floss being the word, I believe, for unfiltered fish sauce. So this is the inscription on one of the little bottles, the tiniest little bottle, and it says Scaurus's floss mackerel garum. So this is the bloody viscera garum. It's unfiltered, it's made from mackerel blood, and it's from the workshop of Agatha Podi, which means Scaurus is the overriding businessman, and he's selling franchises to make fish sauce. So it's actually processed in Agatha Podi's workshop, that Scaurus takes the credit. And in Latin it is garum floss scombri scauri ex officina Agatha Podi. Really, really exciting little bottle. Now, fish sauce in Pompeii. This was the high end fish sauce, elite fish sauce made of mackerel, whether it's liquamen or garum. But this is the other end of the scale. This is a fish sauce shop factory in what was a domestic dwelling that was converted into industrial. In one corner is that all these amphora that have been turned on upside down, and they're standing on the necks of the next one down. And they all contain residue of fish sauce made from local species, thinking that Scourus is importing Spanish and Portuguese fish sauce using mackerel and sardine, possibly. High-end fish sauce that's been processed on its journey across the Mediterranean from Spain. This kind of fish sauce came from the Bay of Naples. It's sprat, herring, sardine, anchovy, pickerel, tiny little species, largely under 10 centimeters, and many of them under 5. And the residue of them is in these little, is in these amphora. And I think what happens is it's caught on the beaches of the Bay of Naples. It's put, the fish and the salt are put into these amphora, and then it's transported into the town and tipped into the dolia. And the dolia are slightly different to the ones we see in the bars, and they have roof tiles on them. And basically the fish sauce is left to finish its fermenting in these dolia, and then you extract your fish sauce from it, and then you rebrine it again exactly the same way. So the gentleman in pale blue shirt is a man called Robert Curtis, who wrote the definitive account of fish sauce in the 1980s. A brilliant book, and it's where I first went to when I started my MA. He took me on a tour of Pompeii. And my husband is in the pink shirt on the left. So this is that little bottle with the inscription on that we got from the store in Pompeii. And I was given a little bag along with it. All the guys who work in the store didn't speak English, and I didn't speak Italian, so it was very difficult. But this little bag contained the residue. And the inscription says garum floss, which means it's the bloody viscera sauce. It's just viscera and blood and salt, so it should be clear. It should have some paste in it, but it shouldn't have bones. But this little pot was full of bones. Does that mean that I'm wrong about the distinction between garum and liquamen? And in the end, because of lots of other evidence, it was clear to me, in fact, that this pot had been reused to sell liquamen. So that pot was filled full of the high-end garum that came from Spain. It was emptied, it was returned to the shop, and it was reused to sell ordinary fish sauce, i.e. liquamen. These bones were sent off to a friend of mine who was a specialist and identified the species, and they were anchovies. And on the bottom right there, you can see the inside of one of the dolia, which still had the fish sauce residue in it, which was fine powder. Everything, all the bones had been completely disintegrated. So lots of food remains, all manner of different survivals because of the nature of the volcanic eruption. But the most famous, of course, is bread. An oven had just been filled with 81 loaves, sealed up, and then I think probably the danger increased. The volcano happened, and they were left in place. And apparently, when it was open, many of them had disintegrated into dust, but a number of them were preserved. They are beautiful loaves, and there's an odd shape to them because there are some with string in that little groove between the top and the bottom, which was very hard to understand. But a lot of the work has been done on understanding these breads now and reproducing them. A lady called Farrell Monaco has been working on the breads of Pompeii. Eggs and lentils, all manner of foods being preserved. So the metal vessels are now being tested as well. A bronze vessel from a tavern in Pompeii was tested for organic residues using a mass spectrometer, and they found, surprisingly, there was meat processing, there was dairy, and there were cereal markers, but that's all they could determine. Very little else. And stable and carbon nitrogen isotope data from the human bones reveal all classes of the residents of Pompeii at a very, very varied diet. Range of cereals, fruits, vegetables, seafood, and meat from domestic and wild animals. And in fact, what they found was the males and the females were apparently eating a similar amount of meat, but the males ingested more seafood, so seafood was more healthy, I guess. And it was possible to determine the status of the bones from a various criteria, including grave goods, but also the nature of the tombs, whether it was just an amphora burial. People used the bones used to be put inside amphora to be buried. A much more healthy Mediterranean diet than was ever assumed. There is not a huge numbers of people subsisting on porridge, while the elite are consuming all the meat. Meat is more widely available. Certainly the cheaper cuts are. The Herculaneum sewers. Now this is a row of shops and industrial units with large numbers of floors containing single room dwellings for extended families. So it's poor living, but the sewer was blocked underneath, and these are the chutes that the rubbish was put down. So it's not just for human waste. It was for human waste, but not just. It was for all kinds of kitchen waste, and it all fell down into the sewer. The sewer was blocked, and there was a wonderful sort of plug of waste that could be analysed. And they found from this material that there was a huge dietary diversity. They found shellfish, fish sauce residues in large quantity, eggs, lamb bones, chicken bones. So the diet of these people was quite good. So the seeds and spices, they don't tend to be preserved. People who buy expensive spices don't actually throw them out on the floor that often. If you're buying pepper in and it's expensive, and it pops out of your mortar when you're pounding it, I'm sure you know it does. They can do. You go and find it. I do. You need damp and airtight conditions for seeds to be preserved, or they need to be carbonized. And carbonized is good in Pompeii. We do find seeds in Pompeii. But we don't find expensive spices very often. They're quite rare. Now, the rarest survival, again, is not in Italy, but Roman London. This was a warehouse that was burnt during the Boudiccan revolt, and there was a little ceramic vessel, very small, and it contained a mixture of spices. So mustard, dill, and fennel, coriander, and nigella. And I've used it using a recipe from Apicius, and it makes an excellent marinade. Brilliant. So huge numbers of food remains were found, and many of these examples are actually from frescoes and textual references too. So Mediterranean herbs that we all know and love. Cumin and coriander, dill, lovage, fennel, mustard, celery, nigella. These are the spices you find in Apicius. They're not expensive. They grow locally. They grow wild. The black ones here are the expensive spices that had to be imported. And they're in Apicius, but it doesn't mean that ordinary people did not use spices and use them well and have an enjoyment of these things. The lemon is an interesting one. There is evidence for citron in Apicius, but there's no evidence at all that they use the lemon in cooking at all. But then they illustrate lemon beautifully in wall painting. So we know we know they had the lemons, but they were not interested in cooking with. So Marcus Gavius Apicius is a famous Roman gourmet. The story, I'm sure you all know the story. He is said to have poisoned his last banquet because he was frightened of living on the food of the common man. He's said to have lived in the region of Pompeii, but there are two other men that are named Apicius for being interested in food. So we can't be certain which one is which. But he was not a cook. He was a consumer of food. His name became attached to the good to good food, and then to a cookery school, and then finally to a collection of recipes which survive in 2 manuscripts only, just 2. And one of them is in the Vatican, the other one is in the New York Academy of Medicine. It's an exquisite book, beautifully illustrated, and it's actually illustrated as if it was a Bible. And we determined, my husband and I, when we translated the Piccius, that it was a training piece, i.e. you don't make errors with the word of God, but you can with a cookery book. So you learn how to illustrate Bibles by illustrating a cookery book. The most important thing to say about it at this point is that it's just called a Piccius. The medieval title, De Re Culinaria, is a medieval title. It was added later. So there are 10 books. These are the titles of the books. The first 5 are cheaper, ordinary food, less spices, very accessible dishes, lots of pulses and vegetables and egg cookery. 6 to 10 are more luxurious. It's Greek in origin. The title pages of each of the chapters is in Greek, and then it's translated into Latin. Very definitely the case that it's the slave cooks who are responsible for these recipes. And there's a big question among some scholars about the literacy of cooks, but I dispute it entirely. It is absolutely the case that they had aspiration and agency in their work. Inscriptions suggest that many of them became wealthy and were respected. And what is most interesting about those inscriptions, funerary inscriptions, is that there are multiple layers of slave on slave ownership. So imagine a situation where a slave is a trained cook, he's good at his job, he earns his living, he hands over some of his income to his owner, but basically he's independent, he buys young boys, he trains them up as to be cooks, sells them on. He can either buy his freedom or is given his freedom by his owner, and he becomes a freed man, and he has a nice big house, and he's a happy man. The new cooks go out in the world, earn their living, make enough money to buy their freedom, buy more slaves, train them up, and on it goes. And the skills move, and life moves on, and people become successful. They play the game. It's the game the Romans made up. You have to play the game in order to succeed, but it seems to have worked for many. This is, again, it's not Pompeii, it's Malaga. It's a tiny villa that's on the outskirts of Malaga, and it's a standard format of villa, but the mosaic depicts every aspect of the cooking process from the cook's perspective. So there's meat and fish hanging up, there's the cooking equipment, there is the trivets and knives, and for me, this is just a cook who's made good, who's built himself a villa, and is celebrating his skills and the equipment of his skills. So one recipe in Apicius, it's just for interest, it's Ostian Ophelli. This is salted belly pork, which is marinated in pepper lovage, cumin, isopatida, bayberry, and little fish sauce. And it's marinated for 3 days. And then you roast it, and it's then served with a oinigarum made with pepper and lovage, fish sauce, dessert wine, and then it's thickened with a little starch, and it's just fabulous. One of my favorite recipes. We do it often. It takes a bit of time, a bit of effort to it, because it's a big slab of pork. It only works with a big slab of pork. Very, very special recipe. So Apician spices, they are curry flavors, basically. It's sweet and sour with honey and vinegar. There's that wonderful umami from fish sauce, which balances everything. But often the flavors are simple and delicate balance of flavors, not huge quantities of spice. The earlier negative interpretation from scholars was, of course, the earlier negative interpretation of these recipes was from scholars who knew Latin but didn't cook, so they didn't understand how to use spices, how to make that balance work. So food frescoes. excuse me, my phone has just gone on. Food frescoes, absolutely exquisite illustrations. Glass, I can't believe that glass bowl. So clever. They just are beautiful to look at. The figs. This is the Villa of Pompeii. That image of the fig is high up in the ceiling. So you imagine them reclining on their couches, looking up at the sky, and finally their eyes focused on this bowl of figs, which is, you can hardly see. It's an amazing concept. The bread being handed out as a election campaign. Somebody who's trying to get elected, so they get somebody to make a lot of bread, hand it out to everybody, and then they'll vote. Very nice. This is special. This cannot be cling film. It looks like cling film, doesn't it? It must be very, very fine woven cloth with silver thread. But it's a basket of fruit. And it's actually in the Villa of Pompeii, the same house. The skill of drawing and painting is just breathtaking. Very difficult to see what kind of fruit. Somebody suggested strawberries, but I think the scale is wrong for strawberries. They're probably apples. So we finish with the pizza. It's beautiful, beautiful image. We've got citron, mushrooms, dates, a piece of bread. There's probably more date on it. There's possibly more, possibly meat. I'm not sure whether that is a knife behind it or a leaf. Very difficult to tell, but it's caused an awful lot of interest, didn't it, when it first came out? It has to be citrons. You can see the image of the citrons beneath. On the bread, there's probably cheese and a fruit paste, maybe a quail's egg. Maybe that little lump is a quail's egg. And on the tray, you've got a peach, figs, dates, chestnuts. A beautiful image. Is it? It's not a pizza. Clearly, it's not a pizza. It's a bread as a plate, basically. First fruit offering, so a libation. You prepare your first fruits and you offer them to the gods. And I think that's kind of situation we have here. It's potentially a direct reference to Virgil's Aeneid, where it is prophesied that he would be so hungry when he lands in Italy that they would have to eat their plates. And the prophecy is fulfilled. And those plates made of bread are filled with fruit because that's all they can eat, because they haven't got time to hunt. Hadn't got time to hunt. They just arrived on land and they were hungry and they just harvested the local fruit. So they put the fruit inside the bread and then ate it, and then eventually ate the bread because they were so hungry. So I think it's kind of a direct reference to that. But how do you define a pizza? I think probably using a tomato, which of course, but still meat and cheese on a piece of bread. Farrell Monaco pointed out this interesting phenomena. On the fresco, you can see there are bread shapes to the right that seem to resemble this, i.e. they have a ridge around the outside. And from Pyston, 6th and 5th century, you've got ceramic versions of breads that seem very similar with a ridge around the outside, which to hold everything inside so it doesn't drop off. And my final slide, if you'd like to know, this is Uzbekistan, and a very similar kind of bread, being made in a very similar way. You prick the middle so it doesn't rise, and apparently people put food inside them. So a fascinating. We are the final two images of beautiful images of food from Pompeii. Any question?
Thank you very, very much, Sally. It was fascinating, fascinating. I know you could go on for hours, and
I could.
it was fantastic. We do have a lot of questions, and Becky can help us go through those questions.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much, Sally. This was so amazing. I actually had the pleasure of visiting Pompeii at one point, and I would have loved to have seen it from with you as the tour
Ah,
guide. Absolutely, to see the food, you know, because they just give you such a small little view, you know, point. But anyway,
yeah.
to go through the questions. Dan, I'm going to try to start at the beginning and go down. And yeah, the graffiti was fascinating. And Dan asked, would the graffiti have complained about the food or say how good it was? Was it sometimes sort of an advertising
I think
for the
more
food?
more likely to be advertising. I think there was one or two um, bits of graffiti that talk about uh, the quality of the wine, for instance. There's one that specifically talks about you can buy this uh, expensive wine, medium price wine, and the cheaper wine, for instance. And that's advertising. It's graffiti, but it's also advertising for the bar. Off the top of my head, I can't think um, of something that says "Don't eat here" because the food isn't very good. That kind of thing. I don't think I see. But
Right.
bearing in mind, I'm dealing with it second hand because I'm not an archaeologist who digs. And so, and I haven't read absolutely everything that's out there. So they could,
Right. Right. And they might discover more things over time, I'm guessing.
yeah. There's huge areas of Pompeii that haven't been dug, and because
Right. Which,
they can't afford to preserve what they have got, and so exposing new stuff is difficult because then you have to preserve it, especially that bar. Those paintings have to be preserved. It means they have to be enclosed. So
um,
the rain doesn't get to them basically.
right. Yeah. Any element. Right. Um, and then Elisa, just comments in Italy, you still pay more for coffee if you sit down than if you stand
Yeah,
at the counter. So it is funny
I
how
know. Yes,
it goes
it's
along.
funny, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. Um, then Dan asked again, how long would it have a banquet meal have lasted and how often were they held?
Um, I suppose elaborate banquets are not going to be every night. You know, the family meal would start just before the light goes, and so the summer it will be an awful lot later than in the winter. And obviously, there's no other entertainment, so you spend a long time eating. One of the reasons why people say reclining to eat is going to be difficult for the digestion, but it wouldn't be if you're spending a long time and you're being entertained and having conversations and getting up, moving around, and so the end of the meal when it's dark is the time when you go to bed in an ordinary domestic setting, unless you're wealthy enough to have candles and lamps going all night.
Um, Susan asked, were these birds actually chickens rather than another type of poultry? Did the chicken as we know it reach the
Oh
Roman world
yes,
by
it is
5C AD?
very much the case. The chicken had arrived, and it's in terms of bone evidence, it's chicken and pork that is prolific in Pompeii, and in large quantity, and in as I say, in modest setting. Uh, shall we say lower middle class settings, where it's the only meat that is available, and of course, pigs and chickens you can raise in cities.
Right,
We don't have
exactly.
pasture. Yeah, so they're and I think they are produced uh, in large numbers. And it's
And
definitely
then,
chicken. Yeah.
right. Um, Eden says there are still other recipes in medieval Italy, and yet if you want to buy offal in the US, it costs the moon, unlike when I was a child when it was poor food. So that's just
Yes,
more of an
yeah.
observation, I guess.
I've organized Roman banquets in America, and I've struggled to get offal on.
I know
And
I have to ask the
it's
butcher to give me you know, when I make my plum pudding, the suet, because that's not something you're gonna find on the shelves, but the butcher will get it for you. That's different than offline, but just that kind of thing. Let me see. And then Margie says, if you don't mention it in the talk, could you please update us on your experiments with what may be silphium? I'm not probably saying it right, but
Silphium.
yeah.
Still struggling with it. The harvest wasn't good this year. We need to wait for another summer, and each year a certain amount of the plants will bloom, and it's only when they bloom that they die, and then you can harvest the resin. And it needs a summer to mature. The flower stalk dies down, and then the root is dug, and the resin is oozed out. I've still got some at home, and I have still tried to make it taste fabulous, and I haven't succeeded. So does that mean it's not silphium? I don't know.
Well, you can come back when you you can give us an update and an updated talk.
I think I'm going to get more. I think we're going to do a flavor profile, some gastro how would he call it? Gastrophysicist in Holland is going to do I think put the resin through a mass spectrometer and work out what the flavor profile is. It does smell like any good incense, like frankincense.
Okay.
And I cooked with it in Istanbul, and we had some quite miraculous flavor experiences. But when I brought it home and cooked with it at home, we got nothing. And I think it's very, very fragile, its flavor, so that I heated it for too long and I stored it for too long. So I think it needs, if it's the pure resin, it needs to be cooked with quite quickly, which doesn't work for silphium, given the trade in it. I don't know. It's quite possible it's not silphium. It's quite possible it's something related and similar, but not it in. Oh, I don't know. It's very hard. I want him to be right, but
right.
I'm on the fence. I'm on the fence when it comes to whether or not I believe it is still.
Right. Eliza also says, I have a bottle of fish sauce from Campina, made using ancient methods.
Oh, you mean coloratura? Coloratura Dominici, yes, it's wonderful. It is made in exactly the same way as fish sauce is made in the Roman world, but it's eviscerated. So all the enzymes that dissolve the muscle tissue into a liquid form are taken away, and then it's aged in the same way for the same length of time as a Thai and Vietnamese sauce is made. So ultimately, it still develops the umami and the protein levels that you want. But they could have made it in 3 months if they would leave the viscera in, but they don't want to. And it's good. It's a good fish sauce. I use it a lot. I'm doing a new cookery book, modernizing ancient recipes. When I say modernizing, I'm using modern techniques to enhance the Roman recipes, because we have so little information about how they made their food desirable and sophisticated. So I'm using modern techniques to do that. And I have a limited amount of, there's a limited options fish sauce. There's red boat, which is the really good Thai sauce that is low in salt. There's coloratura, and there's a new fish sauce that's being made in Lisbon called garum of Lusitanian garum. It's made by a guy called Victor Vicente, who runs a restaurant in Lisbon, and he made fish sauce in the fish sauce tanks in Troya at Setúbal. He used a food grade bag, which he dropped into the archaeology, and then he caught sardine in the Sardo River, put them together and fermented them inside the food grade bag. After 6 months, he filtered it and he now sells it in his shop. And it's fabulous. Just fabulous. But it's about £300 a litre.
Becky, I think we probably only have time for one more question, but people can take a look at the comments that we have there. But maybe just one more question would be great.
I guess, let's see. I know I'm just trying to choose one. The next one was about the garum, and there's two questions, so maybe we can just quickly combine it into one, where Dan said, have you found different recipes for different variations for it? Is there one you prefer most? And then Emanuela said, was it produced in individual households or more in central larger places? So maybe we could wrap that into one question.
I think yes, there was a local production. If you live near the coast and you can get access to a tub full of sardine or anchovy, you'd make your own. Absolutely. Yes, there is 3 or 4 different recipes for fish sauce, and one of them is a Benantine recipe, and it uses an awful lot of herbs. So it takes whole fish cut in half, layers of salt and layers of herbs, thick layers of all 3, and then it's left to dissolve, when you stir it and ferment it. It doesn't give a time scale, and it makes a very, very herby sauce. And it is actually sold as flor de garum out of. You can buy it in Cadiz. You can buy it online as well. A very different recipe. I prefer simple salt and fish. And then any herbs that you're going to add to it, you add at the time when you make your oynegams, when you make your dressing. And then it's always fresh herb. Well, it can be fresh herb. So there's that is the 2 types of production. And I think for production of liquamen, the mass-produced liquamen, it was just fish and salt.
Nice. Well, thank you so much, Sally. This was fabulous. Can we share your email maybe if people have other
Yes, of
questions? Would you
course.
be fine with emailing them
Yes, of course,
back? Because you do, and we can save the chat too, to send it to you that way.
Oh, that'd be good. Yes.
So let me try to do that. I know was able to do it last time, but if you have do you want to just share your email to say it to people?
I can
Put
do
it.
that.
She can put it in the chat as well.
Yeah,
I can put it in the chat.
And I'm trying to see. I know I was able to save the chat another time. I mean, Dan, you should be able to too, as the
okay.
Okay, great.
Yeah, when it records, right.
Yeah. And this is the YouTube.
Oh, great.
Where you can see all Roman recipes prepared using my own kitchen that you saw. So it's the Taste of the Ancient World on YouTube. I haven't got the formal address in my head, and so if you search my name, the title, A Taste of the Ancient World, then you will find it.
Great, thank you. Thank you all for joining us today, and we'll see you next month. And thank you again so much, Sally.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Thank you. Take care.
Cheers.
Bye.